Hello, everyone. Welcome to Random Encounter 247 or 247. My name is Jono Logan, and we are going to be doing something a little bit different today. It's something that we've done in the past, actually. It's going to be Random Book Club. We usually talk about video games here, and today we're going to be talking about the 18th century novel. No, we're not. We're going to be talking about video game books. We're talking about, there was a review that recently got put up on RPG Fan. It's another one of Bitmap Books' opuses, because these things are opuses, and it is a review for the Art of Point-and-Click Adventure Games. The review was by Hilary. Hi, Hilary.
Hello.
It's talking about the third edition. This is the third edition of this book. There have been three of them. Bitmap Books presents, and I don't know. When you were last on, I guess I'm just going to call this segment Random Book Club, even though we've never actually had a segment called Random Book Club, but we might in the future because I like talking about video game books. The last time you were on here talking about books, we were talking about A Guide to Japanese Role-Playing Games, which was also by Bitmap Books, in which we also got an exclusive excerpts and an exclusive review for. They seem to really like us, and that's good because we really, really like them, and we really like the things that they put out.
We do indeed. And it also helps when you have Steph around to discuss her gorgeous cover art.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Steph, our social media manager, Steph, did the cover art for the role-playing game book, and it is just, as everything Steph draws is gorgeous. This is gorgeous. And it really, the cover of that book evokes so many feelings of nostalgia for me.
Me too. She captured that sort of feeling perfectly. And I'm really excited for the reception that it got too on the site, around the review and the time it was published. People seem really excited. So I'm hoping to keep up some of that momentum with more book reviews for their stuff.
Yeah. Well, the last book was, I guess you could say it was a group effort, but there was a group effort from dozens and dozens of game journalists across the spectrum, including a few of them from RPG Fan. This book, on the other hand, does have a bit more of a select group working on it. And I'm just going to list the names here because sometimes when it comes to, I guess, coffee table books like this that are released under Bitmap Books or a publisher, they don't really get that recognition. So it was designed by Steve. If I mispronounce any of these names, I apologize. It was designed by Sam Dyer. It was edited by Steve Jarrett. The writing in it was by Mike Bevan, Will Freeman, Julian Hill, and Damian McFerrin. The interviews in it were by Mike Bevan, Damian McFerrin, Casper Newbolt, and Julian Rignall. The custom pixel art in it was by Craig Stevenson. And the screen captures were by Gonzalo Lopez and Patrick Spacek. So yeah, these folks were the ones who put together the book. And frankly, especially the people who did the interviews, I have to say that I am frankly jealous because some of the interviews in this book, some of the people they got are some of the biggest names in adventure game history, including like Tim Schafer, Ron Gilbert, Jane Jensen. It's really, well, okay, let's just talk about the book for a sec. So it's called The Art of Point-and-Click Adventure Games, and it is about the art of point-and-click adventure games. There's some absolutely beautiful artwork in here showing like full layouts of screens and various versions of the games, and in some places even like design documents and things like that I've never seen before.
Yeah. But
it's not just a matter of showcasing the visuals. It's also a matter of talking about some of the folks who were behind the art, talking about, well, the artists, the designers, and in some cases the writers. I know a lot about point-and-click adventure games and the history of them. I played much of the history of point-and-click adventure games, and I learned a ton of stuff that I didn't know that was in this book.
I mean, the interviews covered a lot of interesting ground. They flowed well. And yeah, I absolutely learned a ton as well going through. I think one of my, in looking stuff up about the book and thinking about it, I think one of the favorite ideas that I kind of came across was the idea that there are these beautiful double page spreads, and Bitmap Books really always pays beautiful attention to their printing and their graphics and things like that. But it's also about, the art of creating the entire game. It kind of looks at the creation process of the game. The whole game is a work of art too.
That's what it is. And there's also quite a bit in here that is original art too. Like one of my favorite things about the book is at the beginning of the vast majority of the interviews, they have little pixel art versions of the developer or the person they're interviewing.
Yes.
And it's great because they're stylized very much as they would be in classic pixel art point and click adventure games.
Definitely. I think one of my favorites, I don't know if you have a favorite pixel art portrait, but I think I think it's Robin Miller that they interviewed for the Myst series. And that just seeing his pixel art cracked me up because I'm used to seeing him and his brother from, the video FMV capture from the actual Myst games themselves. So it was just like, such a funny treat.
In an alternate world where Myst is a point and click adventure game.
Yes.
That's what you're getting. Okay, well, let's talk about point and click adventure games and just for fun, our respective history with them. Like for me, I got into RPGs. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but my first real exposure to point and click adventure games was through Maniac Mansion for the NES. And I didn't know it was a PC, or I didn't know it was on DOS. I didn't have a personal computer back then. I just had my NES. And it was an awesome, despite the fact that Nintendo made them do some interesting things censorship-wise, very interesting things. The Maniac Mansion point and click adventure game for NES is very, very true to the original, and it plays great. And then years later, I was in Walmart, like many years later, I was in Walmart and walked by one of their LucasArts adventure game treasure collections or something like that. And it had Maniac Mansion Day, the Tentacle, Sam and Max Hit the Road, and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis in one package.
Oh, what a great find.
Yeah, and I was like, Maniac Mansion, what's this? Yay! And I got it, and I quickly discovered that my parents' computer could not play it. It was that old. It would install it, but it wouldn't play it because there was something wrong with the sound card. But eventually we figured it out, and it became one of my favorite point-and-click adventure games. And that started my love affair with the entire genre.
Oh, that's great.
What was your or your origin story with point-and-click adventure games?
Well, I have definitely had many instances, throughout the 90s and the early 2000s of trying to play point-and-click adventure games and having sound cards or various things going wrong.
Oh, sound cards.
I think it's just, comes with the territory. But my family, we were, I think, relatively early adopters computer-wise, honestly. So my first point-and-click adventure game was King's Quest IV. So I was a little bit more familiar with things from the Sierra side. So I played King's Quest first, a few of the different King's Quest games.
You're the Coke to my Pepsi.
Yes, essentially. But, as I learned more about the genre and as they started releasing some of those, box sets in the later CD-ROM days, I was able to kind of go back and check out some LucasArts games too. And just really, I was super excited to see Rosella in the lead role in a video game as a, I don't know, 7-year-old, I think, girl. And that's how it started. Yeah,
female protagonists back then were rare. So when it happened, especially when it happened in a way that didn't feel exploited, she wasn't a damsel in distress. She wasn't being portrayed as a sex object or anything like that. She was a character. Mm-hmm. That was fairly rare back then. I mean, arguably it's still rare now, but back then it was a departure, but not for Sierra, because Sierra was known for its female creators, mm-hmm. Especially in comparison to just about every other studio out there. I mean, the founders of it, Ken and Roberta Williams of Sierra Systems, were pioneers in terms of adventure games, like obviously King's Quest 1, which, okay, well, that's an interesting thing that the book talks about, which is Sierra adventure games, especially in the earlier days, were technically not point and click because they didn't use a mouse.
Correct.
They used text parser and the directional keys on the keyboard to get around. So instead of like LucasArts style being you go down, you click on the verb open, you click on the door and your character opens the door, you would have to type in I open the door or open the door and make sure your character was beside the door, and then your character would open the door.
You're not close enough.
Yeah. And that would lead to a lot of problems that if you didn't get the exact right combination of words, it wouldn't understand you, which was a bit of a clunky system.
I actually, the end of my review kind of plays with that a little bit.
Yeah, I saw that. The text parser was a really nice touch.
Thanks.
Get book. What book? You'll have
Yep.
to be more specific.
Exactly.
The Witch Edition is a funny joke. Have you ever seen? There's a music video by. Wow, it's funny when something that you know really well. Jonathan Colton.
Oh yeah.
He released Solid State, and the song "All This Time." The music video of it is a text adventure.
Okay, I need to see this.
It is amazing. I'll send it to you after. The official, his last album, Solid State, which I love. The entire video is just a text adventure game of the classic type. So I'll send that to you. Anyway, the point is that most graphic adventure games grew out of text adventure games, including in some ways, the input method. Like you could move your character around with the arrow keys, but realistically speaking, it just added a graphical component where the soul of it was still pick up the rock. I don't see a rock. Pick up the big rock. Oh, okay. And it wasn't until a few years later that the mouse started catching on, specifically with Apple computers, because it was the first, the Apple computers were the first one that actually had a mouse. Point and click adventure games started evolving from there. And then LucasArts, of course, got on the Verb train. And point and click adventure games started developing out of that. Now, technically, I would still classify early Sierra games as point and click adventure games, I guess, just because they're the origin of the genre. Like, what would you think?
Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion I arrived at as well, just because they're so closely related. And everything I think that Sierra's done was sort of inspired by kind of those very early, like, text-based games.
It's funny. My big takeaway of some of the interviews, especially with Ken Williams and Ron Gilbert, and then talking about some of their teams and some of the people who worked at both Sierra and LucasArts, or Lucasfilm Games, it was known in the earlier days. While they were still having to deal with all the same problems we have today with crunch and things like that, both of them seemed like incredible places to work. Just like magical places to work, in terms of these were people who were doing things that had never been done before, and they were figuring out genres, and it kind of made me feel jealous. Like, could you imagine being part of those teams?
That dovetails with a big takeaway of mine, which is just how instrumental and how much point and click adventure games are part of the development of how we've used computers.
Oh yeah,
in
absolutely.
general, and they really pushed things along. And as computers changed, they were the ones determining, a lot of new interfaces and what you could and couldn't do, and pushing the limits of the hardware.
Well, I think for people who are listening to this podcast, RPG fans specifically, both adventure games and RPGs offered them something that a lot of video games back then didn't have, which was, story and characters. Like before graphics and action could catch up, adventure games were telling epic tales with like really well-developed characters in a way that was impossible for other genres of video games at the time
to do. Yeah, at all.
Yeah, and out of that, I mean, most games, I would actually argue any game that has a significant narrative component today owes a massive debt to point-and-click adventure games and are direct descendants of those games, even if they are technically in a different genre.
Looking at your visual novels.
Exactly. Well, let's take Myst, for example, which is a point-and-click adventure game. It's a first-person point-and-click adventure game. Like you could easily see how that perspective evolved into things that are technically not point-and-click adventure games, but like Curse of Obra
yes.
Or I think it's Obduction, their spiritual successor to Myst, which is technically not a point-and-click adventure game, but is very much it feels a lot like Myst. Like they have the different areas, which are the different ages and things like that. It's a great game.
It really does.
Which I recommend that people play because it was pretty cool. One of the things that really drew my attention in the book that they kept talking about, which blows my mind. I mean, I guess I knew this academically, but it's the fact that point-and-click adventure games, even in their heyday, like the greatest point-and-click adventure games of all time, were never really all that profitable.
Right. In so many of the interviews, you kind of get this sense of like, on one hand, knowing that these games were popular and are popular, and they had this great kind of word of mouth. But on the other hand, how many copies did they actually sell, and how much money did they actually make? So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, like it kills me that where I'm trying to, I doubt I'm going to be able to find the exact section, but I think it's in the Ron Gilbert interview where they're talking about Secret of Monkey Island. And it's like, yeah, we sold like 50,000 copies. It wasn't a big hit at the time. The only reason it got a sequel is because the sequel was already in production when we released the game. And it's like, holy crap, that's insane. Because you think Monkey Island and you think like, that's one of the biggest adventure game franchises of all time.
Right.
But like, it didn't even sell 1 million units in its initial release. I guess also there was the install base and things like that, and a variety of, it was only on one platform, but it's still mind blowing when you think about video game and the business today.
Yeah. I think that might have been I want to say it's in the Dave Grossman interview.
One of the coolest things I found about the book is going through, well, first off, there are a lot of games that they talk about in here that I guess I've heard about in the past, but I never really knew about or played. And I would like to actually play them now, like especially from some indie developers that I never knew about. I'm trying to find an example here. Goblins, for example.
Yeah, that looks like a really good one. I did not know that the Simon the Sorcerer games were voiced by like half the cast of Red Dwarf, which is a show that's very dear to me. So I feel like I need to go and play those now.
And I mean, I also got to relive some of my childhood cringe because, like I said, back when I was a kid, I loved point and click adventure games. They were my favorite genre. So like it was a compilation, all 5, technically, if you go by the numbering system, 6 of the Leisure Suit Larry games. And to my like 10-year-old self, that was, oh my goodness, they were very adult and very risque. And I'm a little embarrassed by that now because they're kind of cringe. When, like you mentioned Leisure Suit Larry, it's like, that's...
that is something that may not have aged well at all.
I would argue it's probably the Sierra series that has aged the worst out of them.
And there's actually a little tidbit in there, I think in the Ken Williams interview, where they heard some like financiers, or I don't know who it was, but someone like editing or like looking at their games talking about at the time, like those awful sexist Leisure Suit Larry games.
I think my favorite line in the whole thing was Al Lowe being like, "Yeah, we were working on it, and one of the designers was a born again Christian, so we refused to do anything for the game, so it was just us," which I thought was pretty funny.
That is actually, I think that's also true of Mark Siebert, who did a lot of the Sierra music, but that's okay because I think Al Lowe also was pretty musically inclined, so I'm sure they were all right.
Yeah. I'm just like, I have a copy. I have the second edition, the actual second edition. Oh, by the way, I should mention to anyone, if they have bought the first, maybe it's not the first edition, but if you bought the second edition of the book, Bitmap Books sent me a free PDF update of it. So I read the third edition for this book club, even though I only have the second edition, but it's the same book. It's like there's some additional content. I was hoping, Hilary, why don't you tell us what's new with the third edition?
Sure. Let's do an overview of what's new in the third edition. You mentioned that the book is mostly chronological with the interviews kind of interspersed. Mm-hmm. So they extended the date. So the third edition has games through 2021. Yeah,
the second edition ends in 2020.
So that's really exciting and current.
They still make adventure games in 2021.
And actually, the big 2021 game is Genesis Noir, which is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And then the other, Strangeland. So yeah, they did some chronological updates. And then we mentioned the Grossman interview. Dave Gilbert from Wild Jedi is another big interview.
Yes, he is the designer of many point-and-click adventure games of the recent years, including Unavowed. He has a new one coming out in a few months, or maybe years. I'm not sure when it's coming out, but it looks amazing, called Old Skies.
Yeah, our preview of it was very positive. So
yeah, Neil wrote a preview of it for us.
We'll have to link to that. But I'm really excited to check it out. And let's see how I'm going to butcher the name. But the developer of Kathy Rain.
Oh yeah, right.
Joel Hasto.
Yes, Kathy Rain is an interesting game. I think I wrote the review for the director's cut. Actually, I know I wrote the review for the director's cut. And I liked it. I didn't love it. I played the original, But one thing that I cannot possibly say against it, it is a gorgeous game, and
Yes.
with some excellent puzzles and things like that. I had a few problems with it, but on the whole, it's great. I love indie point and click adventure games. Like, well, we were talking about my history of point and click adventure games. A lot of the stuff that came out of Wadjet games, they're developed on the Adventure Gaming Studio
Yes.
platform. And this is a open source platform that is available to anyone who wants to use it. But like years and years and years ago, I was downloading these. Essentially, they were fan made games. They were developers, but they were like amateur game designers. And some of the adventure game studio games that they created were absolutely amazing. And many of them, of course, eventually started working as professional game designers, including, of course, why am I blanking? Dave Gilbert.
Yep.
And many of the other games that came out on those from Wadjet Games as a publisher.
That interview is especially interesting because it kind of like explains that trajectory and, his process making games and being part of those, adventure game studio jams, and then figuring out like at what point he could help become a publisher and help other people popularize their games. And, the point he realized that the studio was going to make it big, I think was with Gemini Rue, which was, I think, an early game that they published. So it's a very interesting read.
I mean, the whole thing is an interesting read. Some of these interviews are just fascinating. And the interviews all sort of follow a similar trajectory where they kind of open it up with saying, like, what's your history with point and click adventure games? Did you always know that you had like artistic tendencies when you were a child? But then they spin it off, of course, into the specifics of the games themselves. And they're not, like we said, they're not just interviewing the artists, although many of the artists and designers are featured here. They talk about the game design sensibilities that went into them. There's a lot of behind the scenes conversations, like I mentioned a second ago. Like, crunch was a massive problem at these studios, as it is today, with classic people sleeping under their desks. And back then, these were not like hundreds of people developer teams. Like, what blows your mind when you read about some of these seminal games and they had development teams of like 4 people.
Yeah.
And that would just be amazing.
It's difficult to even imagine.
I know. I know. And especially in the earlier days, they talk a lot about the restrictions that were put on the artists at the time in terms of the tools they got to use.
Yeah, very true. And in some cases, if they wanted to do something for a game, they made a new tool to make it work.
Oh, yeah. Like, well, Scum, for example.
Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking of. You knew it.
Utility for Maniac Mansion. And like, the artists I think my favorite thing is a lot of the artists are just like, have you ever tried drawing with a bar of soap? That's what it's like to work on. That was what it was like to work on earlier, because they had to design everything using the mouse because like Photoshop didn't exist and scanners cost thousands upon thousands of dollars. So they couldn't digitize their like hand drawing. So they had to draw everything on computer.
I remember a bit in one of the LucasArts interviews where they were super excited to have one scanner because it made their job so much easier.
Oh, no. Was it they weren't super excited though. I can't remember. It was one of them. They were like, a scanner. What the heck is this crap?
Right.
I don't need, there was one artist who was like, what the hell is this? A scanner? That's terrible. I can do it all on the thing. And then they saw the results and they were like, oh,
right. Okay. I was skipping ahead in my, brain to the part where they realized how much work it saved them.
Oh yeah. It saved them so much work, but it's just funny that it doesn't matter if something better comes along. It's just like, you're still so stuck in your workflow. You're like, no, I'm doing it the way I do it.
I'm sure many of us have seen that or can relate to that somehow.
It's so many amazing games that really don't get featured very often, even by us, because they are sort of, I don't want to say forgotten, but like, even there are some LucasArts adventure games that I haven't played and that I've been meaning to play for years. 3 of them, actually. Zack McCracken, which was the follow-up to Maniac Mansion and looks very, very similar. Loom.
Ah, yes, Loom.
And Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And I really need to play those games.
There are so many. Loom was, I think I mentioned this like at the beginning of my preview. It's one that I missed out on, but I saw the art and then just like had to learn everything I possibly could about it. And I caved and watched a playthrough of it, but I still really want to play it.
It looks beautiful, and I mean, it's technically using scum, but instead it doesn't use any verbs. It instead uses musical notes for puzzle solving.
And there's some really neat ways that they use that. I think one of my favorite things, and I think they explain this a little bit in the book, is that because they're using these musical notes for Bobbin to, do his spells, you learn the spells, throughout the environment. However, you can actually, if you play the spell backwards, you can actually have the opposite effect sometimes. And so that's kind of worked into the puzzle solving.
Which is really cool, and the kind of thing that seems obvious when you say it, but like playing the game, maybe not.
Yeah.
When it was developed, they were trying different things and trying to figure out what works.
And that ended up being a very unique mechanic. I mean, I can think of a handful of other games that use music to that degree. I think Wander Song is the first one that comes to my mind. But yeah, just really, really fun.
It is. One of the things that you mentioned in the review, which I kind of alluded to with like a lot of anything that has a narrative nowadays owns a tremendous debt to point-and-click adventure games. And technically, are they point-and-click adventure games? Or are they adventure games like Firewatch, for example?
Yep.
Feels like it should be in this book, but it doesn't quite fit under the genre. It's kind of like our never-ending conversation about whether or not we should cover Metroidvanias.
It is, because this book really makes you think a lot about that. How do you classify something when it has this through line kind of throughout a lot of like computing history? Where do you draw the line? What exactly do you need to have for it to be a point and click?
Yeah.
Obviously not a strict point and click interface anymore, because some of the games don't exactly have the strict classic interface.
No, I actually, one of the cool things that when I was reading it, I recently went on a bit of a retro quest, because I had them sitting in my library for a while, and I decided to play some of the LucasArts Double Fine remasters that were out. So like a couple of months ago, I played through Day of the Tentacle Remastered, and I played through Full Throttle Remastered. And it's always interesting playing games like that, because especially games that you loved as a child, like, do they hold up? Do they still work? And boy, howdy do they.
That's so good to hear. The thing I did most recently that was similar to that was Grim Fandango. Which obviously I'm going to say it held up well. And for fun, I switched some of the dialogue to Spanish.
That's a nice touch. How is the Spanish? I would imagine good.
I'm not an expert, but it seemed to function pretty well. Like the localization of it seemed pretty good.
Yeah.
From what I could tell.
I imagine it was somewhat similar to, like, back when I would do French immersion, it was basically English deprivation. We weren't allowed any English media or conversation. English was like contraband. You like smuggled English like cigarettes. But I discovered that Ratatouille works way better in French than it does in English for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But and that's not discounting like Patton Oswalt or any of those performances, but it's just like, oh yeah, this takes place in Paris. They're all French. This makes sense.
Exactly.
And I imagine it would be very similar with Grim Fandango.
That basically sums up my feelings pretty well. Although it was like, I would say I know kind of the opening and the opening dialogue the best. So it was interesting to see like kind of how they translated some of the wordplay, right? And colloquialisms and things like that, because there's a lot of that. Well, anything that Tim Schafer writes, is pretty dense, like localization wise.
To put it mildly, yes. Yeah. Man, I would love to see some. There's not really a market for it, but I would genuinely love to see some history of the AGS, like a history of the AGS communities and some of the amateur games that were made back then, and how they developed. Like I remember some of the developers, they aren't game developers now, but they developed into big game personalities. For example, Yahtzee from Zero Punctuation.
Yes.
For those who don't know, he is a video game reviewer, and probably I would say the funniest video game reviewer on the internet. His Zero Punctuation series is amazing, but he designed a series of point-and-click adventure games. And actually, there was one that used a text parser instead of point and click, that were like really dark and scary in places, but like really, really great story, really, really excellent writing. So it's interesting to see how that community spun off a lot of people in the gaming industry and their careers.
Definitely. I mean, you see that story or similar stories multiple times, especially with like the more recent games. In the third edition, there seems to be like a real sense of community.
And it's some of the stories about, I find some of the stories about their earlier games interesting as well. Like, let's just call you a minor fan of the game Myst.
Yes, that's fair.
I'm trying to find the Myst interview here. They talk to
Robin
yeah,
Miller. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. They talk to him about the games they made before
Yes.
they developed Myst. The Manhole, for example.
Mm-hmm.
These games were for Mac essentially. They were developed in HyperCard years and years ago. And they were very innovative for their time, and like they made games for children essentially.
Yeah, but just kind of like there was an interesting discussion, sort of like around artistic freedom and brainstorming and generating ideas for these earlier games versus Myst, and it was a really neat theme to that interview.
It's interesting how point-and-click adventure games have sort of become, well, I mean, indie, because AAA studios aren't really touching them with a 10-foot pole. There are games that use ideas of point-and-click adventure games like Life is Strange and such like that, but like that style, like the classic LucasArts Sierra style of point-and-click adventure games is in the domain of indies now. But what I found interesting, especially reading about the early days at Sierra and LucasArts, is there was a very indie mentality at the time where the developer and the publisher didn't really give a crap about what they were working on, or they were just like, a bunch of people would be in a room and they were like, I want to write a game about pirates. And they're like, all right, go at it. Whatever.
Let's watch a bunch of Errol Flynn pirate movies.
Yeah. So they would they were in Skywalker Ranch. They would just take over one of George Lucas's like studio or theaters and just watch a ton of pirate films.
Did you watch the documentary Double Fine Adventure?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Because I started looking through this book kind of at the same time. I was rewatching that. And I got a little bit of the feel of how that watching them kind of start to develop Broken Age felt a little bit like maybe it would have been back then, but just amped up, amplified many times.
If anyone out there is curious what we're talking about, it's called Double Fine Adventure. And it's I guess it's a documentary series. The entire thing is on YouTube.
Yes.
Focused around the Kickstarter for Broken Age and talking about like it's the development there, and it's figuring out how to make a game.
And this book happens to be like fairly LucasArts heavy, I would say. And if you're a fan of LucasArts at all, there's plenty of Tim Schafer and a decent amount of Ron Gilbert in it.
Yeah, and that's another cool thing they talk about is in those interviews and other interviews with some of the people behind the art, talking about the differences between developing an adventure game today in comparison to what it was then, because like Broken Age is trying to carry forward what they were doing at LucasArts. And Thimbleweed Park, for example, their pitch was, this is like a LucasArts adventure game that you find in the bottom of your drawer that you have never seen before, but adopts the mentality that I think is the best way to do a retro anything, which is it plays the way you remember it playing rather than the way it actually was.
Yes. That could be quite the distinction.
Yeah, it can. Oh man, Myst. I've never played Myst. I played it a little bit, but I've never actually gotten my way all the way through it. I really should.
It's definitely worth it. I have to admit, and I think I've said this on Retro, the thing that really got me through it and got me playing most of the series was actually the novelizations.
I had the novelization of Myst when I was in middle school.
Nice.
I don't think I read it. I think it was on my shelf, though, so people would think I was an intellectual video game fan at the age of 13.
Fun personal story, which I don't know whether we're going to keep this in or not. We'll see. But I think I got that book in like 5th or 6th grade is when the first one came out, the Book of Atris. And I accidentally left it at my elementary school after, I think, between 5th and 6th grade. And then we had a different classroom, so I kind of forgot about it. And then I came back to visit a couple years later to see, because it just happened to work out that I had the same teacher for about half of elementary school. So I was pretty close with her. So I came back to just say hello because I lived right down the road from my elementary school. And she told me that only myself and one other classmate of mine who was a good friend were ever able to actually had the fluency to read it in 5th or 6th grade.
Oh, that's nice.
It was really sweet. But anyway, that was a tangent.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned that because this is this is Random Book Club. But back in those days, back in the 90s, a lot of game developers, there was a lot of crossover with different genres, and novelizations of games, especially like narrative games, were pretty popular. And Myst was the biggest. Myst was,
Yeah.
for its time, this thing. I would argue that Myst is probably responsible for selling more computers than just about any other piece of software in the mid 90s.
Yeah, not to mention the whole effect it had on like CD-ROM and the development and use of CD-ROM and computers. Yeah.
The game still is gorgeous in terms of its design. And there have been a lot of different versions of Myst released over the years. There's a few remasters. I know there's a full remake called Real Myst, which is it's first person freedom, so you can just walk everywhere, unlike the original, which is like screen. Yep. But the original was it was a system seller for sure. Like, video games didn't look like this,
and that's very rare for something in this sort of like narrative point and click genre. They were not generally system sellers.
No, they weren't. I find it interesting how for many people in the gaming industry, point and click adventure games was where they wanted to work. Because that's where you got the freedom, that the narrative freedom, and the musical freedom, and the artistic freedom, the design freedom.
Exactly. In many ways, it kind of pushed technology forward. But from a consumer perspective, you might have been like slightly less aware of that, or not, depending on how closely you're paying attention.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that this book specifically, I mean, it's the art of point and click adventure games. One thing that it demonstrates is just how insanely beautiful these games were.
And distinctive.
Yeah.
Like, you would think there's only so much you can do with pixels, but I mean, there's so much variety here.
Oh yeah, like Loom, going back to Loom again, it's gorgeous to this day. And I'm not even talking about like re-releases where they updated the art from 16 colors to 265 or 256 colors. Like, I'm talking about the original. It's stunning.
Yeah.
Like, they're just beautiful, beautiful games.
I think one of my other favorites is the Quest for Glory series, because, Laurie and Corey Cole have been active and experimenting and making newer games like Hero U. So you can kind of look at the games over time and how they changed and how they're all, in their way, extremely pretty.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, maybe it's because most backgrounds were static. There wasn't a whole lot of movement. Like, there was a little bit of scrolling in some of them. They could really spend the time on making these incredibly detailed environments that really immersed you in a place, whether that be in like the classic third-person style that we recognize from like most LucasArts and Sierra games, or the first-person style of Myst. No, this book is. I got it for Christmas. And it's been sitting on my shelf for quite some time, because although I was very interested in it, it's a big friggin' book.
Yes.
And this gave me a really great excuse to read it. And I am so glad I did.
I commend you for reading it cover to cover, by the way. I kind of had to approach it in chunks and go back and forth and come back to it and leave many, many times.
It's really funny going through it, because we talk a lot. We talk a lot nowadays about remasters and the hot and remakes, and the current hot topic is The Last of Us Part 1, which is, why are you remaking The Last of Us? It was only released a few years ago. You just released a remaster. Why are you doing a remake? And it's like it's this new thing, and it's like it's a fad that they're just remaking all their games. And what's hilarious is going through Sierra's early Sierra games, especially, it's like half if you think you know what King's Quest 1 looks like, no, you don't, because you probably haven't played King's Quest 1. You've probably played the remake of King's Quest 1 that got released a few years later on a completely different engine.
Yep.
For Sierra especially, they're like, a lot of their bread and butter seem to be releasing expanded versions of their classic games in their updated adventure game engines.
Yep. And collections and things like that. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing in this book. When I think point and click adventure games, I pretty much think about PC, or I guess Mac, but I think about personal computers.
Yes.
It seems like over the years, attempts to port a lot of point and click adventure games to consoles has been met with failure, interesting successes at best, shall we say. because these games are designed with the idea of a pointer in mind. It's a point and click adventure game. And
Exactly.
in recent years, it seems like there have been genuine efforts to figure out an interface on consoles that works for point and click adventure games. And I'm still not sure they've done it, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I mean, there have been some interesting successes. There have been, functional methods so far.
You can play it.
Yeah. But I think I'd have to agree with you. I don't think anything has quite approached that kind of the sense of immersion you get from being able to use the mouse.
Yeah, especially for this genre. It's just it's
So-
hard to pixel hunt when you're using a controller.
It is, and I'm a pretty sensory person, and I always felt like playing point and clicks, kind of using the mouse, just helped my sense of immersion, because it felt a little bit like a natural continuation of the way you would just track your eyes around looking for something.
Let's talk about current generation
Sure.
point and click adventure games, because that's, I mean, kind of it's not the emphasis of the third edition, because it obviously has all of the material from the early editions, but some of the games that have been released in the last few years, have there been any that have really made a massive impact on you?
Oh, I'm gonna have to start by admitting that I have not had as much time to play as I would like. But some recent like point and click adjacent games that have made more of an impact on me. From what I've seen, I haven't had a chance to play it much. And I mean, 2018, that's not super recent, but kind of recent. Unavowed, definitely.
Unavowed was so good.
Yeah, I love kind of the concept description of it, where they said, just kind of like the conceptual description for Unavowed, which I think actually makes a ton of sense, is a BioWare narrative structure, but where you can pick your party, you go out, and depending on who you bring with you, puzzles change or solutions to situations change, but just within that kind of point and click style.
Yeah.
I just think that's such a neat idea, because that narrative structure, like, a lot of people really like that about those games.
Well, I've recently got really into BioWare. I didn't really play a lot of BioWare games except for KOTOR, and that was years ago. And I played Unavowed before my recent binge of BioWare. And now, like, looking back forward at my time with Avowed, yeah, that's so true. It's like a BioWare game without the combat.
Right? That's wild.
And it's just a gorgeous game. Like, the pixel art in that game is just sensational. I've reviewed a number of like more recent point-and-click adventure games for the site, including Whispers of a Machine, which I really liked. It was, I think I described it as it's not a super substantial game. It's a short story. And as a short story, it was quite enjoyable. And Kathy Rain, of course.
Yeah.
A game that I've not reviewed for the site, but I was delighted to see it get a really big feature. And they interviewed one of the developers behind it, and they gave it some art, because I think it's a gorgeous game, is Fran Bow.
Yes, I was going to mention that. And Little Misfortune, which I'm yeah.
Have you played Fran Bow?
A little bit.
It is so screwed up. I just love it. Like, it's not the best point and click adventure game I've played in the last few years. It's not even the best modern point and click adventure game I've played in the last few years. But I think its visual identity and its animation and what it is doing is it's a very memorable game for me.
Yeah, it sets it apart, definitely.
Yeah, I was really happy to see it get a spotlight in the book.
It has such a distinctive visual style. I would kind of feel like this book might be a little bit incomplete without it.
Yeah. What did you think of Broken Age?
I really enjoyed it. I went in definitely not expecting it to be, an old LucasArts game, or I tried to like what's the term? Oh my gosh, manage my expectations around it, and I think that was pretty effective because I enjoyed it a lot. I know a lot of the puzzles aren't quite the same, and depending on which part of it you're playing, there are some pacing issues, and the puzzle difficulty kind of is not consistent between the two halves, and just the fact that there are two halves at all. But I don't know, I just got very swept up in the characters and the art style, so I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it. It didn't quite hit the way I was really hoping it was going to hit me.
That's
that
fair.
being said, there were some characters in it that, felt very much, they were very original, but they felt like it had the same magic as those point and click adventure games. Like the character of the tree, for example, is absolutely hysterical.
Yes.
Yeah, just this tree that has a massive problem with humans.
I mean, I get it. I I can imagine that.
Oh yeah, totally. And it's so funny because we talk about like how point and click adventure games vanished, and they did if you lived in the West and America. I guess in my case, Canada. But point and click adventure games were always very popular in pockets of Europe, and during that drought, there were several exceptional games that were Siberia, for example, and a
Yes.
number of others.
And Siberia is actually new in the third edition, so that's a good game to bring up.
Yeah, Siberia.
Ooh, can we count the Longest Journey series?
Yes, we can count the Longest Journey series. What's their name? Pendulo Studios.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they did a game series called Runaway, which I kind of consider to be almost a spiritual successor to Broken Sword
Oh, nice.
in many ways. Which I'm going to be completely honest and say I did not enjoy Broken Sword or Broken Sword 2. I feel terrible saying that because they are classics of the genre, but I didn't like them very much.
Don't feel bad. They're classics I missed out on, so I have not played them yet.
I didn't play them when they were out. Like obviously, like especially when they came out, like oh my god, these games look incredible. But when I played them, they just, I don't know, they never really clicked for me, especially the ending of 2. The ending of 2 is terrible. But Runaways are road adventure. The first one is fine. It's short, pretty game, very pretty game. Has a very interesting visual style I think its visual style, I think, makes it look like it has a bigger budget than it does. Like it uses cell shading in a really interesting way. But they've released several games in the Runaway series. They had a classic point and click style adventure game called Hollywood Monsters, and it was using pixel art, and it looked like a classic point and click adventure game. It was never released in English, and then they did a complete remake of it called The Next Big Thing, which postulated that all of the Hollywood monsters, like in the 1930s, were actually real, and they were all movie stars.
Oh,
And it's like this detective story, and it's fun. They have done some very interesting games that I have enjoyed. And then, of course, there's the thing that a lot of people, we don't feel comfortable talking about anymore because it was such a disappointment, and they're back now, which is Telltale.
yes.
Last summer, I watched NoClip did a documentary on Telltale Games and their closure last year, and it's one of the most heartbreaking docs I've ever seen about a video game studio, and specifically, obviously, because it was closing. But like, especially in the early days of that studio, where they were, before they got wrapped up in trying to make as many IP related games as possible, back when they were doing their first game was actually, have you ever read Bone?
No.
It's a comic book series by Jeff Smith. Hilary, I can't say for certain, but I have this odd feeling that you specifically would really, really love Bone.
Okay.
It's a fantasy series. Like it's set in a fantasy world. It has like elements that kind of look Disney, but it doesn't. It's really interesting. Anyway, the very first game that Telltale released was Bone Out of Boneville, which was a adaptation of the comic book series. Unfortunately, it was never. It was an episodic adventure game, but they never completed the series. Yeah, they only completed like this one. Out of Boneville was the name of it. I know it sounds suggestive, but there's nothing suggestive about it. It's just called Bone. I'm going to recommend that to you, and I don't know why I think of you and fairy tales in the same sentence. I don't know. Do you like fairy tales?
Yeah. I mean, any sort of like myths or fairy tales.
Yeah, myths and fairy tales. I feel like Bone is something that would be right up your alley, by a guy named Jeff Smith.
Perfect. Okay.
And the other one, which is another thing that I think would be up your alley, and which also dovetails into Telltale Games, which is the comic book series Fables, which is a long-running comic book series, which Telltale adapted into a episodic adventure game.
Is it Wolf Among Us?
The Wolf Among Us, yes, which stars the big bad wolf as the sheriff of Fabletown.
That is one of the few Telltale games I have some experience with. And yes, I enjoyed the game, so I probably would enjoy the comic series too.
I think you'd really enjoy the comic book series. I think it's right up your alley. And The Wolf Among Us 2, very tragically, it was going to have a sequel. And then Telltale, of course, closed. But it's announced that the developers of The Wolf Among Us are back. They're releasing the sequel. It's being developed right now. So we're getting the sequel, which is very exciting.
It is. I'm eagerly anticipating it and hoping the best for the team.
Yeah, I am too. But like Telltale Games released, obviously, they're best known for The Walking Dead nowadays, which I played the first one. It wasn't my cup of tea. It was fine. Just wasn't quite my kind of game. But I firmly believe that their Sam and Max series, all 3 seasons of Sam and Max, are just exceptional games.
That's so great to hear. Like, I know it's like a little bit of a focal point in the book.
Mm.
Just the interesting kind of full circle experience of Telltale, like getting the rights to some of those old properties like Sam and Max and Monkey Island.
Okay, I got to be honest. Like, even when I said like before they started doing IP, but I mean they were always doing IP. I think they created one or two original IPs, but realistically speaking, there was like it was Bone, and then they did Sam and Max. Those series, they did a series of adventure games based around Homestar Runner called Strong Bad's Cool Game for Attractive People.
Yep. Speaking of which, why have we not referenced the Strong Bad email about text-based adventure games yet?
Oh, Peasant Quest.
Yeah.
Yes. For those who did not grow up on the internet in the 2010s, or was it or was it just the 2000s? Homestar Runner used to release many classic game parodies, and they released like a full parody of King's Quest called Peasant's Quest.
It was surprisingly involved. Like, it is actually a pretty fun functioning adventure game.
Yeah, it is
in many ways.
Well, they also like they released a Mega Man parody called 20XD6 too, which was a side scroller. Yeah, it's funny. They what were they? The brothers. What were their names? The brothers something. Brothers. Why am I blanking? I'm always blanking. The brothers Chapman. That was it. There were 2 guys, the Chapman brothers.
Yes.
And they developed Homestar Runner. It was one of the biggest.
Unfortunately, I was blanking too. I'm like, I know what you're talking about.
Yep. It was one of the biggest things, and it was in the 2000s. It was 2000 to probably about 2010. And they had like, it was a heck of a run, like massive amounts of fans, and they created this entire universe. And of course, they got Telltale to do an adventure game based on their property, and it's a pretty damn good adventure game.
I would really like to see some of those games, like if they continue updating this book, just because it's such an interesting cultural touchstone that this amazing and funny internet phenomenon has just such a deep appreciation for, and such thorough references to like these games. I don't know, it'd be an interesting addition.
Oh yeah, completely. And like, what else did they do? They got the license to Monkey Island, and they did technically the 5th Monkey Island game, which is a 5-part adventure series called Tales of Monkey Island.
Yes.
And they did Back to the Future, the game, which I wouldn't argue that I'm the world's biggest Back to the Future fan, but I would argue that I'm probably in the top 100, considering I'm looking at my prop replica flux capacitor right now. I enjoyed that game for what it was. And then, of course, they did The Walking Dead and The Walking Dead 2, and they did Tales of Borderland and Game of Thrones and Batman and Guardians of the Galaxy and, oh my God, so many others. And then all of a sudden it all started to fall apart. Yep. Oh, well. Bottom line is, if you are a fan of point-and-click adventure games, that this is the kind of book that you really should have on your shelf. At least I think so.
Yep. Whether you want to use the fantastic art to convince people that video games, in particular point-and-click games, are an art form, or you already know a lot about the genre, there's still more to learn in this book. There's so much information. Like, even if you were a seasoned adventure gamer, you will find some new things.
Oh my God, yes. And like, especially with some of the newer games, like a game that I really would like to check out, which I hadn't even heard of before, is a game called The Lion Song.
Yeah, that looked really good.
Yeah, it looks gorgeous. It's set in pre-war Austria. It uses a very limited color palette.
Yeah, kind of sepia.
Yeah, it's sepia color palette to create a very interesting looking game. It just looks really, really cool. And there were other games like classic. I'm saying classic because they came out like 10 years ago. Hang on, I'm trying to find it here. Where is it? Oh, I mean, here's a game. Kentucky Route Zero came out. Finally, the last part came out very recently, and that's been on my to play list for years now. I just wanted to wait till the whole thing came out to play it.
Same. And then if you turn the page, look how good Broken Age looks in that double page spread.
Yep.
It looks so good.
Oh, the game I really want to play, which I haven't yet, is The Whispered World.
Yeah, that sounded really, really good.
Yeah. I mean, these games are, if you love adventure games, there are so many games out there that you've probably never played before, and many of which we have not reviewed. And to be frank, I would love to get some more adventure game reviews. I mean, I would argue maybe people listening to this on staff might disagree, but I would say that you and I are probably the biggest adventure game fans on the site.
Yes, there were more of us.
At one time. If we disappear, you know what happened.
Yes. I have a question.
Yeah.
Were there any games that had prominent spreads or features in this book where you thought, I didn't know anyone else ever played that game? Because I had one.
What was it?
Future Wars.
I have never played Future Wars.
It was one of those games that my childhood bestie had at her dad's house. So I only got to play it like very, very infrequently. And it fascinated me and it drove me nuts that I couldn't finish it.
Aw, that's too bad.
That's another one that I think, like Loom, just has really, really gorgeous artwork because it's got, a time traveling motif. So you have these really pretty future backgrounds and medieval backgrounds and modern city backgrounds. You get a little bit of everything.
I would say that probably Freddy Farkas Frontier Pharmacist.
Right. And that's the game that Josh Mandel himself was lead on, right?
Yeah, it was kind of like, it was a sort of spin-off from Leisure Suit Larry. I think at one point they were like, he's Leisure Suit Larry's great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, I think in some of the publicity at the time. But it was a very funny game. And it's funny because normally Sierra isn't quite my cup of tea because I don't like dying in adventure games.
It's fair.
But there are so many games, like, while they cover, it'd be impossible to cover everything. Like, heck, they cover Star Trek Judgment Rights and 25th Anniversary, for gosh sake. They have a feature talking about there's the Scooby-Doo adventure game for Sega Genesis. Like, there are a lot of games that are niche, I guess you could say, that are included in this.
And some licensed games. Like, I think Daria's Inferno is in there too.
Yep, Daria Inferno's in there too. But like the Beavis and Butthead adventure game isn't.
Right, which I've heard is the better one of the two by far.
I've heard it's actually pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Which, who would have thought, the Sega Genesis, home of point-and-click adventure games, starring 90s cartoon characters.
Early Mike Judge, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the death of the adventure game has been one of those things that people... I think a lot of the same people who said adventure games are dead are the same people who said 2D games are dead back in that period of time when the idea of doing a 2D side-scroller was a massive risk, and it'd be much better to do a very poorly optimized 3D platformer.
Right.
I feel like that sort of mentality was the same thing, and adventure games never went anywhere. Like I said, they... like we were talking about, they went to Europe for a while, and then Telltale had a resurgence, and then they went to the indie space. And they're still in the indie space, and they're still there, and they're going to be remaining there. And I mean, one of the biggest announcements for me and for a lot of people was that there's going to be a new Monkey Island game coming out.
Yes. So perfect time to check out this book before that releases. It's Ron and Dave are both working on it.
Yep, both of them are coming to do it, and it's coming out this year. Which it's coming out this year. I'm not convinced about that. I feel like that's a aspirational release date, but we'll see.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be. And a very interesting art style, which I didn't get any hate mail about it in the last episode of Random, where I complained about the internet ragging on them for the art style. But because it's a gorgeous art style that looks almost like paper puppets. Like,
yeah, I liked it in the trailer. I have to admit.
Yeah, it's like Monkey Island by way of Paper Mario.
But I mean, they need this book because how much has Monkey Island's art style changed?
I know.
It's actually a lot.
Well, there's like several different art styles. There's the original pixel art style,
exactly,
of 1 and 2. There's A Curse of Monkey Island, which went to like full Disney animation style art. There's Escape from Monkey Island, which kind of translated that to 3, sorta. There's Tales of Monkey Island, which sort of translated that into a more modern day context where it lost some of the cartooniness. Then we have the remakes of the remasters of Monkey Island 1 and 2, which it has a very divisive art style. So yeah, give it a chance. Believe me, the developers know what they're doing. And if you don't believe me, buy this book and read it, and you will then believe me.
There's some evidence right there.
There's a bit of evidence.
Yeah, I got to admit, I think at some points that's those sorts of like transitions and trying different art styles. Sometimes I think LucasArts did that a bit better than Sierra. I'm thinking of King's Quest 7 right now, which, some parts of it looked really pretty, but a lot of people complained about the art style in that one.
Well, if you are curious about the art style of King's Quest VII or any of the other Sierra or LucasArts adventure games, check out The Art of Point-and-Click Adventure Games, because it is a gorgeous book that is filled with beautiful artwork and just some unbelievably in-depth, interesting interviews.
Yes.
It really does teleport you back to a different time of game history.
It does.
It does. It's very good.
And I think it really, one of the points that hit home for me, and I think it's a pretty good, closing point, is just how much that creativity is still there. And like you said, these games haven't really gone anywhere. There are plenty of people still making this art, still making these games, and they're still beautiful.
They really, really are. Well, that was this episode of Random Book Club. If you want to listen to our prior episode of Random Book Club, you can find it in our Random Encounter archives, where we talk about a guide to Japanese role-playing games, which was, again, a great book. So we have tons of episodes of Random Encounter that you can check out, but that we are not the only podcast that we have here at RPG Fan. We also have Retro Encounter. And 2 weeks ago, Hilary, you actually took lead on a very special episode of Retro Encounter focusing on game accessibility. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I did. It was a really, really fun episode. It was one of our kind of special topics. And it was three of us just kind of going through, talking a little bit about what gaming accessibility is, why it's so important, how it helps keep games creative, and how it's not just making games easy for people. And we talked a little bit about games themselves and the different features they have, some resources to learn more about what sorts of tools are out there for accessibility, and some of our favorite and least favorite aspects and tools and things that are done for accessibility as well. It's
an incredibly important topic. And I'm glad that you had an opportunity to focus on it. That is fantastic.
Me too. I'm really grateful. And I think the episode came out well.
And we also just had Retro just released their latest episode, which was focusing on Tales of Xillia, Part 1.
Yes.
So they'll be continuing that probably next week. We also have Rhythm Encounter, which is RPG Fan's music podcast. Last week was Square Dance, and that was focusing on the music of strategy RPGs, because I guess grid-based strategy games, Square Dance.
Uh-huh.
Yeehaw.
Yeah.
And next Monday, it's going to be focusing on just Super Nintendo, the Super Nintendo. Probably not the Super Nintendo games that you would think of, but Super Nintendo music from other RPGs and other games in genres that we cover from the Super Nintendo era. So yeah, check that out. We'll be back in 2 weeks, of course. If you would like to get in contact with us, you can fire me off a message at podcast@rpgfan.com. I'd love to hear from you if you have any ideas for future episodes, discussion questions. I love getting discussion questions from people. Alternatively, if you have an idea for RPG Fan Book Club, please give us a heads up. If you'd like to send me an email, you can do so at jlogan@rpgfan.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Jono_Logan. Hilary, where can we find you online?
The best way to reach me for RPG Fan or game book related stuff is Discord, and I'm EP Fire on Discord.
Cool. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to share it with your friends to help us get the word out there. You can rate us on iTunes or your other podcast players of choice. Hilary, again, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about this book.
Thanks for inviting me.
Look, any excuse to talk about point-and-click adventure games, honestly.
Yes, I agree.
I love talking about point-and-click adventure games with you specifically. The last time we had it, I guess it wasn't really an opportunity to talk about point-and-click adventure games, but the last time we were on an episode talking about a point-and-click adventure game, you made a cameo as an admiral who was chewing me out on the Star Trek episode.
Yes. I remember that.
Which was The openings of those two episodes are, discounting the karaoke episode of Rhythm Encounter, probably the stupidest thing I've ever done for the site. But oh my
I
god,
need
they
to
were
listen
fun.
to them.
Oh, they're
again.
so dumb. They're so stupid.
Ah,
You don't even listen to the whole episodes. Just listen to the opening of both of them because, oh, they're dumb. I can't believe Solosy let me do that.
it's fun.
It was
It's good
very fun.
And then before that, it was adventure game music.
Yes, we did an adventure game music episode, which was great.
Yeah, that was a really good time.
Yeah, we're just going to keep forcing adventure game content on the site, so get ready, everyone.
Yep.
So no matter what, whether you're playing an RPG or you're playing a point-and-click adventure game, whatever you're playing, have fun.